Chapter 7, Part 2 of the 8 Strokes of the Clock. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Lenny. The 8 Strokes of the Clock by Maurice Leblanc. Chapter 7, Part 2. A few minutes later, a sound of voices rose from the other side of the house, no doubt near the well. The sound grew more distinct. A number of people flocked into the house. Some of them went upstairs to the first floor, while the sergeant arrived with a young man of whom Rénine and Hortense were able to distinguish only the tall figure. "Jérôme Vignal," said she. "Yes," said Rénine. "They are examining Madame de Gorne first, upstairs in her bedroom." A quarter of an hour passed. Then the persons on the first floor came downstairs and went in. They were the procurator's deputy, his clerk, a commissary of police, and 2 detectives. Madame de Gorne was shown in, and the deputy asked Jérôme Vignal to step forward. Jérôme Vignal's face was certainly that of the strong man whom Hortense had depicted in her letter. He displayed no uneasiness, but rather decision and a resolute will. Nathalie, who was short and very slight, with a feverish light in her eyes, nevertheless produced the same impression of quiet confidence. The deputy, who was examining the disordered furniture and the traces of the struggle, invited her to sit down, and said to Jérôme: "Monsieur, I have not asked you many questions so far. This is a summary inquiry which I am conducting in your presence and which will be continued later by the examining magistrate. And I wished, above all, to explain to you the very serious reasons for which I asked you to interrupt your journey and to come back here with Madame de Gorne. You are now in a position to refute the truly distressing charges that are hanging over you. I therefore ask you to tell me the exact truth." "Mr. Deputy," replied Jérôme, "the charges in question trouble me very little. The truth for which you are asking will defeat all the lies which chance has accumulated against me. It is this." He reflected for an instant, and then, in clear, frank tones, said: "I love Madame de Gorne. The first time I met her, I conceived the greatest sympathy and admiration for her. But my affection has always been directed by the sole thought of her happiness. I love her, but I respect her even more. Madame de Gorne must have told you, and I tell you again, that she and I exchanged our first few words last night." He continued, in a lower voice: "I respect her the more inasmuch as she is exceedingly unhappy. All the world knows that every minute of her life was a martyrdom. Her husband persecuted her with ferocious hatred and frantic jealousy. Ask the servants. They will tell you of the long suffering of Nathalie de Gorne, of the blows which she received and the insults which she had to endure. I tried to stop this torture by restoring to the rights of appeal which the merest stranger may claim when unhappiness and injustice pass a certain limit. I went 3 times to old de Gorne and begged him to interfere. But I found in him an almost equal hatred towards his daughter-in-law, the hatred which many people feel for anything beautiful and noble. At last, I resolved on direct action, and last night I took a step with regard to Mathias de Gorne, which was a little unusual, I admit, but which seemed likely to succeed, considering the man's character. I swear, Mr. Deputy, that I had no other intention than to talk to Mathias de Gorne. Knowing certain particulars of his life, which enabled me to bring effective pressure to bear upon him, I wish to make use of this advantage in order to achieve my purpose. If things turned out differently, I am not wholly to blame. So I went there a little before 9 o'clock. The servants I knew were out. He opened the door himself. He was alone." "Monsieur," said the deputy, interrupting him, "you are saying something, as Madame de Gorne, for that matter, did just now, which is manifestly opposed to the truth. Mathias de Gorne did not come home last night until 11 o'clock. We have 2 definite proofs of this: his father's evidence and the prints of his feet in the snow, which fell from 9:15 to 11. Mr. Deputy, Jerome Vignal declared, without heeding the bad effect which his obstinacy was producing, I'm relating things as they were, and not as they may be interpreted. But to continue. That clock marked 10 minutes to 9 when I entered this room. Monsieur de Gorne, believing that he was about to be attacked, had taken down his gun. I placed my revolver on the table, out of reach of my hand, and sat down. "I want to speak to you, monsieur," I said. "Please listen to me." He did not stir and did not utter a single syllable. So I spoke. And straightway, crudely, without any previous explanations which might have softened the bluntness of my proposal, I spoke the few words which I had prepared beforehand. "I have spent some months, monsieur," I said, "in making careful enquiries into your financial position. You have mortgaged every foot of your land. You have signed bills which will shortly be falling due, and which it will be absolutely impossible for you to honor. You have nothing to hope for from your father, whose own affairs are in a very bad condition. So you are ruined. I have come to save you." He watched me, still without speaking, and sat down, which I took to mean that my suggestion was not entirely displeasing. Then I took a sheaf of bank-notes from my pocket, placed it before him, and continued: "Here is 60,000 francs, monsieur. I will buy the Manoir au Puits, its lands and dependencies, and take over the mortgages. The sum named is exactly twice what they are worth." I saw his eyes glittering. He asked my conditions. "Only one," I said, "that you go to America." Mr. Deputy, we sat discussing for 2 hours. It was not that my offer roused his indignation. I should not have risked it if I had not known with whom I was dealing. But he wanted more and haggled greedily, though he refrained from mentioning the name of Madame de Gorne, to whom I myself had not once alluded. We might have been two men engaged in a dispute and seeking an agreement on common ground, whereas it was the happiness and the whole destiny of a woman that were at stake. At last, weary of the discussion, I accepted a compromise, and we came to terms, which I resolved to make definite then and there. 2 letters were exchanged between us, one in which he made the Manoir au Puits over to me for the sum which I had paid him, and one which he pocketed immediately, by which I was to send him as much more in America on the day on which the decree of divorce was pronounced. So the affair was settled. I am sure that at that moment he was accepting in good faith. He looked upon me less as an enemy and a rival than as a man who was doing him a service. He even went so far as to give me the key of the little door which opens on the fields, so that I might go home by the short-cut. Unfortunately, while I was picking up my cap and greatcoat, I made the mistake of leaving on the table the letter of sale which he had signed. In a moment, Mathias de Gorne had seen the advantage which he could take of my slip. He could keep his property, keep his wife, and keep the money. Quick as lightning, he tucked away the paper, hit me over the head with the butt end of his gun, threw the gun on the floor, and seized me by the throat with both hands. He had reckoned without his host. I was the stronger of the two, and after a sharp but short struggle I mastered him and tied him up with a cord which I found lying in a corner. Mr. Deputy, if my enemy's resolve was sudden, mine was no less so. Since, when all was said, he had accepted the bargain, I would force him to keep it, at least in so far as I was interested. A very few steps brought me to the first floor. I had not a doubt that Madame de Gorne was there and had heard the sound of our discussion. Switching on the lights of my pocket-torch, I looked into 3 bedrooms. The 4th was locked. I knocked at the door. There was no reply. But this was one of the moments in which a man allows no obstacle to stand in his way. I had seen a hammer in one of the rooms. I picked it up and smashed in the door. Yes, Nathalie was lying there on the floor in a dead faint. I took her in my arms, carried her downstairs, and went through the kitchen. On seeing the snow outside, I at once realized that my footprints would be easily traced. But what did it matter? Was there any reason why I should put Mathias de Gorne off the scent? Not at all. With the 60,000 francs in his possession, as well as the paper in which I undertook to pay him a like sum on the day of his divorce, to say nothing of his house and land, he would go away, leaving Nathalie de Gorne to me. Nothing was changed between us, except one thing.